Night in the western desert did not fall so much as erase. Engines cooled beside shallow scrapes in the sand. Far from the coast, where the known war seemed to end, men listened for aircraft that could not yet be seen and for trucks that might already be too close. A patrol could vanish there without battle, without witnesses, and without a grave. In that vastness, confusion was often deadlier than gunfire. To the armies fighting for Egypt and Libya, the desert appeared at first as an emptiness flanking the real campaign on the coast. Maps thinned into guesswork. Tracks dissolved in the wind. A column that missed one well, one landmark, one bearing, could lose its strength before meeting the enemy at all. Behind the drama of tanks and artillery lay a simpler danger. Britain did not yet know how to see across the desert. The British position in 1940 was more fragile than later memory allows. France had fallen. Italy had entered the war. In North Africa, the British Empire held long lines with limited men, limited vehicles, and a constant anxiety over distance. The Italians sat in fortified positions across Libya, while the British command in Egypt had only fragments of knowledge about what lay beyond the coastal belt. An army can fight uncertainty for a short time. It cannot plan on it for long. What made the problem so grave was that the desert was not empty at all. It concealed roads, wells, landing grounds, isolated forts, wireless posts, and supply movements that could alter campaigns far away on the Mediterranean coast. If those hidden routes could be found and used, a small force might observe an army from behind. If they remained unknown, British headquarters would continue to make decisions half-blind. The desert was a void only to those who did not understand it. The man who did understand it had not earned his authority in the ordinary military way. Ralph Alger Bagnold was a Royal Engineers officer, but he was known at least as much for his pre-war explorations as for formal staff work. In the 1930s, he had crossed the Libyan desert by motorcar, studied dunes like a scientist, and learned by experience what sand did to engines, tires, compasses, and men. To many conventional officers, that made him interesting. It did not necessarily make him reliable. He was not the kind of figure who naturally dominated headquarters in Cairo. His expertise had been built in expeditions, not in parade ground reputations. He had spent years solving problems that few senior officers considered central to modern war. How to drive over broken dunes, how to navigate without landmarks, how to judge the desert floor by color and texture, how to save fuel over impossible distance. Those were unusual accomplishments. In 1940, they began to look essential. Bagnold had learned one truth above all others. The desert punished weight. It punished unnecessary steel, unnecessary fuel consumption, and any machine built on the assumption that brute force could solve every terrain problem. What mattered was not simply power, but balance, lightness, range, reliability, and the skill to move without roads. This was the logic that led him toward a vehicle many soldiers would have regarded as the wrong answer before it ever touched the sand. The truck that became central to his thinking was not a glamorous weapon, and not, in origin, a weapon at all. It was a Chevrolet 30 CWT truck, a commercial design whose virtues were simplicity and endurance rather than military prestige. In the logic of the Orthodox Army, a light two-wheel drive truck seemed inferior to heavier four-wheel drive military machines. In the logic of the deep desert, matters looked different. Less weight meant less sinking, less consumption meant more reach, simplicity meant survival. From his expeditions, Bagnold also brought a quiet revolution in navigation. A magnetic compass inside a vehicle was easily disturbed by metal and unreliable across long desert travel. He therefore developed and refined a sun compass, using the position of the sun rather than magnetism to hold a bearing across featureless ground. It was a simple device with immense consequences. A patrol that could keep direction by day and reckon distance by experience no longer had to cling to known tracks. He persuaded General Archibald Wavell to let him try what many others found improbable: a small, independent desert reconnaissance force operating far behind enemy lines. In July 1940, the Long Range Patrol, soon renamed the Long Range Desert Group, began to take shape. Bagnold sought men who could think without waiting for orders at every turn. He found many of them in New Zealanders in Egypt, men he believed possessed the self-reliance that such work demanded. Even with official approval, skepticism remained close. Deep desert travel was still widely treated as a geographical stunt rather than an operational method. Irregular units often attracted suspicion in armies that relied on order and standardization. Quartermasters preferred standard issue. Staff officers trusted conventional routes. There were voices that regarded Bagnold's ideas as an eccentric side project, useful perhaps for occasional reconnaissance, but hardly something upon which a campaign should depend. The trucks themselves became part of that argument. Bagnold and his men stripped them down, reducing weight wherever possible. They added sand channels, enormous loads of fuel and water, extra cooling arrangements, weapons mounts, wireless sets, and navigation equipment. The changes made the vehicles look improvised, almost unfinished, as if they belonged more to explorers than soldiers. Yet this apparent crudity concealed a severe intelligence. Every removed panel and every added can had been judged against distance, terrain, and return. The first patrols in 1940 carried more than weapons into Libya. They carried a question: whether the desert interior could be turned from a barrier into a route. The answer came slowly, mile after mile. Patrols moved south of the known frontier, skirted Italian posts, recorded wells, measured distances, and proved that long penetrations were possible. Reports came back not as grand announcements, but as bearings, sketches, timings, and observations. Intelligence in the desert was built from patient accumulation. Those early journeys revealed something British command badly needed to know. The enemy's rear was not sealed. Vast areas thought operationally useless could in fact be crossed by small mobile groups. Forts were isolated, airfields were vulnerable, supply movement depended on a limited number of routes and water sources. Information that looked modest on paper altered the scale of the war. For Wavell, the desert was no longer only a flank, it had become a concealed approach. The first success of Bagnold's conception was not a celebrated battle, but the fact that the patrols came back at all, having gone where ordinary doctrine said they should not. By late summer and autumn 1940, the Long-Range Desert Group had justified its existence. It had gathered intelligence, demonstrated endurance, and forced the Italians to think about threats in their interior. A blind area on the map had begun to speak.
That success remained partial because the work was still experimental and the dangers still extreme. The patrols were few. Mechanical failure could still end a mission. Radio silence, so useful for concealment, could turn difficulty into isolation. The men learned to travel by stars, sun, and dead reckoning, to hide by day, to repair in the open, and to judge whether a patch of ground would bear a loaded truck. Knowledge grew, but so did exposure. In January 1941 came a more aggressive test. The LRDG worked with Free French forces in a long desert movement against the Italian position at Merzouk in southwestern Libya. The raid proved that the group could do more than observe. It could strike. The airfield was attacked, aircraft and installations were damaged, and the desert route that made the operation possible astonished those who still believed such movement impossible. Yet the victory was not clean. Merzouk cost lives. The Free French commander, Colonel Colonna d'Ornano, was killed. LRDG men were also killed and wounded. The raid exposed a truth Bagnold had never denied. Long-range mobility did not spare men from ordinary violence. It merely delivered them into it by an unexpected path. A force built on intelligence and endurance could still suffer from daylight fire, confusion, and the brutal economy of isolated combat far from reinforcement. Soon after, the long desert system helped support the campaign that ended with the capture of Kufra by Free French forces in March 1941. The achievement mattered well beyond the oasis itself. Kufra offered a southern base and confirmed that operations once considered fantastical could now be mounted with method. The desert, mapped by patrols and held in memory by drivers and navigators, was turning into a military environment in its own right, but the learning was not finished. One of the clearest lessons concerned vehicles. At one stage, the LRDG was issued heavier Ford F-30 four-wheel drive trucks, a more orthodox military solution than Bagnall's preferred Chevrolets. On paper, they seemed superior. In practice, they consumed too much fuel, carried the burden of their own extra complexity, and proved less suitable for the immense ranges that defined deep desert work. The officially correct vehicle was, for this peculiar war, often the worse one. That mechanical disappointment was more important than it first appeared. In ordinary campaigning, an inefficient truck is an inconvenience. In the Libyan desert, inefficiency could mean that a patrol never reached its objective, or reached it too weak to return. Fuel was radius, weight was time, reliability was intelligence. The commercial Chevrolet, dismissed by some precisely because it had not been conceived as a heroic military machine, continued to justify itself where doctrine had failed. By 1941, the war in North Africa had also changed character. The Italians were no longer the enemy. German forces under Erwin Rommel entered the theater, bringing a new operational tempo, harder discipline, better tactical coordination, and an enemy commander deeply alert to surprise. What had begun as reconnaissance against an overstretched Italian system became a contest against a more dangerous opponent who valued mobility as much as the British now did. This raised the stakes for every patrol. German air reconnaissance, armored cars, and increasingly effective signals intelligence made survival more difficult. A column hidden by distance could still be found from the air. A careless transmission might betray a position. Rommel's army also depended on a long and fragile supply system, which made British intelligence more valuable than ever. The same desert that hid British patrols hid the arteries that kept the Africa Corps alive. At this moment, another experiment entered the story and nearly ended in failure. In November 1941, David Stirling's young Special Air Service attempted its first major parachute raid during Operation Squatter. The wind, the darkness, and the inexperience of the unit combined with savage effect. Men were scattered in the desert. Some were injured on landing. Some never reached the objective, and the operation collapsed before it could inflict the damage intended. It was a disaster of method. The answer came from adaptation, not pride. Stirling turned to the long-range desert group, which already knew how to move men through the desert without depending on parachutes or regular routes. The LRDG began carrying SAS raiders deep behind enemy lines, dropping them close to airfields and installations, then waiting to recover them after the strike. It was an alliance born from failure. It was also one of the most productive military partnerships of the Desert War. Here again, the supposedly wrong truck proved right. The same stripped commercial vehicles that could carry observers for weeks could also deliver raiding parties across distances that would have defeated conventional transport. They moved with fuel, water, ammunition, wireless sets, and machine guns enough to survive alone. Their crews knew where to hide, how to navigate, how to read the desert, and how to get wounded men home. Mobility became not a supporting detail, but the means of action itself.
The LRDG's most important contribution was not always the violence it delivered directly. Often it was the intelligence it enabled. Patrols watched roads, counted vehicles, logged timings, mapped landing grounds, and reported enemy dispositions from places where the British were not supposed to exist. What reached headquarters were concise wireless messages, but behind each message lay weeks of movement, concealment, and technical skill. The Desert Force turned observation into operational knowledge. During the Seesaw campaigns of 1941 and 1942, that knowledge mattered immensely.
Rommel's army lived at the end of a supply line stretching westward through ports and along the Via Balbia. To strike blindly at his front was one thing. To understand the movement behind it was another. LRDG patrols conducted road watches and long reconnaissance that helped British commanders estimate enemy strength, direction, and intent. In the desert, counting trucks could matter as much as counting tanks. The threat, however, continued to grow. Axis commanders recognized that British deep desert activity was not random nuisance, but a systematic challenge. Patrols were hunted by aircraft. Wells could become traps. Italian Saharan units in German columns learned to search wider and move faster. Every success made the next journey more dangerous. The long-range desert groups survived only by refusing routine. Routes changed, halts changed, camouflage improved, wireless discipline tightened, experience hardened into craft. Bagnold himself did not remain forever at the wheel of this experiment. As the unit expanded, command passed to other officers, and he moved on to broader responsibilities. Yet the system he had devised endured beyond his direct presence. That is often how military innovation truly works. The founder does not simply win a battle and remain at the center forever. He creates a method others can use under conditions he may not personally witness. By late 1942, as the struggle moved toward El Alamein, the value of that method was unmistakable. The LRDG's road watches and deep reconnaissance helped expose enemy traffic patterns at a moment when the British could not afford misjudgment. This was not the romance of raiders alone. It was disciplined intelligence work performed under exceptional physical strain. In a theater obsessed with armored clashes, small patrols in light trucks were quietly helping to define what the enemy could still do. There was no single instant when the Chevrolet truck won the Desert War. History does not usually permit such simplicity. Tanks, artillery, logistics, naval control, air power, code breaking, and industrial output all played their parts. Yet in the particular sphere of desert intelligence and special operations, the LRDG's trucks altered what was possible. They extended British reach into spaces where no formal front line existed. They allowed information to be gathered where the enemy felt safest. That mattered because modern war is rarely won by strength alone. Rommel's columns could strike hard, but they could not easily defend every route that fed them. Airfields could be rebuilt, but not if their location and routine were constantly exposed. Forts could resist attack, but not uncertainty. The LRDG's movements forced the Axis to spend effort on guarding the rear, dispersing aircraft, escorting convoys, and imagining threats across a landscape they had once treated as protection. The underdog element in Bagnold's story lies not in personal melodrama, but in the kind of knowledge he represented. He brought into war a form of expertise that looked marginal until events proved otherwise: geology, navigation, vehicle economy, observational patience, and the habits of exploration. Such things do not sound decisive in peacetime speeches. In the Western Desert, they became instruments of survival and leverage. He did not overpower the desert. He learned its terms and taught others to do the same. The truck at the center of this transformation remained an unlikely symbol. It had been built for carrying loads, not for carrying strategy. It looked too plain, too exposed, too improvised to embody military innovation. Yet stripped of excess and joined to a system of navigation, wireless reporting, and independent crews, it became something more than transport. It became a platform for intelligence, infiltration, and endurance. In the right hands, an ordinary machine changed the scale of action. This legacy ran far beyond North Africa. The partnership between the Long-Range Desert Group and the early SAS helped shape the future of special operations. Small units, long penetration, precise intelligence, flexible transport, and raids designed for strategic effect rather than spectacle. The principle would appear again in many wars afterward, under different uniforms and on different terrain. Surprise would increasingly belong not just to the strongest force, but to the force that could move unseen and understand first. What changed warfare forever in this story was not merely a truck, nor even a unit, but a way of thinking. Bagnold's Desert War showed that the most important breakthrough may come when technology is simplified rather than enlarged, when navigation becomes more important than armor, and when information gathered by a handful of men can redirect the calculations of armies. It was a lesson in economy, of motion, of fuel, of words, and of violence. In the end, the Western Desert did not remember rank or theory. It remembered competence. It remembered who could find water, who could keep bearing, who could return with news, and who understood that a line on a map was meaningless if the terrain refused it. Britain's victory in North Africa came from many sources, but among them was the quiet triumph of intelligence over ignorance and adaptation over habit. And so the story closes not with triumphal noise, but with a long view across the sand. A civilian-patterned truck, judged by conventional standards to be the wrong kind of machine, became central to the right kind of war. An engineer-explorer, initially valued by many as an eccentric specialist, helped teach an empire how to see in emptiness. In that lesson lay the future, that deception, mobility, and human thought would increasingly matter more than brute force alone.